former candidate for the U.S. Senate, longtime radio talk show host, author, and conservative policy advocate.
Justices to the Supreme Court, the left has been in open panic.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Unbelievable. Just unbelievable. Though nothing is unbelievable anymore in 2020, a year which will certainly live in infamy. The president gets COVID-19 a month before the election. What are we supposed to think now? Welcome back into yet another crisis edition of Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America network. 2 days after his fight night with Joe Biden in the first presidential debate, President Trump announces to the world that he's come down with a virulent virus that's hit over 7 million people, throwing an already chaotic political environment into total disarray. We'll discuss the health, political, and constitutional crises that could arise from this. And we'll try to put this insane, unprecedented year in some type of perspective when we're joined by Liberty Nation Editor-in-Chief Leesa K. Donner. Plus, we'll bring in LibertyNation.com's Jeff Charles to discuss his article entitled Alarming American Attitudes About the 2020 Election, which hits right at the heart of the diminishing integrity of elections in the eyes of so many. And LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza drills deep on the explosive case of Breonna Taylor, which is sparking widespread unrest in Louisville and elsewhere on Talkin' Liberty.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We commence the proceedings with our signature segment, Say What?, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. And no doubt you uttered those very words, say what? When you woke up Friday morning to discover the president and first lady have the COVID. And the questions were many, the drama at peak level.
Who else was exposed in the West Wing? Will the president's senior advisors and the vice president also go into quarantine? The campaign is totally frozen in time, and the president had a very crowded schedule of campaign events over the coming days. Also, the presidential debates. We're supposed to have 2 more debates. We're supposed to have a vice presidential debate. Will those go on? Obviously, all of that uncertain.
This was a code red moment for the U.S. government before we even had these diagnoses from FLOTUS and POTUS. This may be the most dangerous moment that the U.S. government has ever faced. The president is suffering from a deadly virus. This feels like something we should be watching on an episode of Homeland.
A deadly virus. The average age of death among those who've died with COVID is 78, most with underlying conditions. President Trump is 74 with a potentially troubling condition. And on MSNBC, Dr. Vin Gupta sounded the alarm and unsurprisingly took the opportunity to blame the president for his disregard of COVID protocols.
He has a significant comorbidity, a risk factor, in addition to his age, which is being overweight. The combination of the two, I've cared for several patients in the ICU who have that double whammy. They're older and they're overweight. They have a bad trajectory, meaning they start developing shortness of breath or a cough or fever. So this is a very serious situation for the president. Perhaps the way he's been behaving and messaging has been wrong, and now he's unfortunately bearing the brunt of that consequence.
Well, that was a typical reaction in the elite media. And like all the other unprecedented crises the people, the voters, have been forced to process in 2020, they will now have to figure the president's physical condition into the mix when deciding how to vote. But the election campaign will continue in some form depending on how Trump gets through this period of quarantine. And at the heart of the debate over this election is the question of who controls the two parties and the prevailing ideologies of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. While we know what Trump is all about, he tells us every day in every way. How about Biden? an historically moderate candidate by Democrat standards who's been all but held hostage by the rising tide of left-wing progressives in his party. When you vote for Joe Biden, what are you voting for? The Democrat nominee said he won his party's nomination because he was not a socialist like Bernie Sanders on many issues, but particularly health care. But Trump was having none of it in Tuesday night's debate.
Biden wanted to allow people to have private insurance still. They can. They do. They will under my proposal.
It's not what you've said, and it's not what your party has said.
That is simply
your party
a lie.
doesn't say it. Your party wants to go socialist medicine.
My party is
and
me.
socialist
right
healthcare.
Now, I am
and
the
they're going to dominate
party.
you, Joe. You know that.
I am the Democratic Party right now.
Trump says the left will dominate Biden, who in turn says he is the Democratic Party right now, even though he's adopted positions far to the left of his own expressed ideology over almost 50 years. Only the voters can decide whether Biden is his own man or not. And only they can decide what to make of this much-debated question and answer by Trump on whether he would condemn white supremacists. And he ridiculed the idea that the rampant mob violence in cities across the land was anything but a product of far-left extremism.
Who would you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and right
Proud Boys, stand back and stand by. But I'll tell you what. Somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left, because this is not a right-wing problem. This is a left-wing. This is a left-wing problem.
White supremacists. Antifa's an idea, not an organization.
Oh, you got to be
not
kidding.
militia.
So Trump tells a right-wing group to stand back, but Biden actually denies the very existence of the domestic terrorist organization identifying as Antifa. Go ahead and ask any of the people who saw their communities destroyed whether the Antifa organization exists. But if there was a single soundbite from the debate which Trump supporters would like to resonate and have legs, it revolved around the number 47. And former Bush 43 Press Secretary Harry Fleischer used it to deliver a devastating critique on Biden's refusal to say whether he'd pack the Supreme Court with more progressives if he became president.
In 47 months, I've done more than you've done in 47 years, Joe.
When he said, I've done more in 47 months than you've done in 47 years, that was a pretty good way to sum everything up. And I still think that Joe Biden is leaving himself very vulnerable because he just refuses to take a stand out of weakness. He acknowledges it. I won't give you an answer on court packing or on filibuster because I don't want my answer to be the issue. What kind of leader or statesman answers a question like that?
Indeed, the question of leadership is what voters must ultimately decide during these trying times. But leadership qualities and policy debates may in the end shrink in comparison with the fight over the actual outcome of the election already being waged by both campaigns before, during, and after the debate. Trump touting what he calls a scandalous distribution of unsolicited mail-in ballots and relying on the Supreme Court and the prospective new Justice Amy Coney Barrett to bring it to a final resolution. The last Democrat nominee saying a while back that Biden should never concede, and senior Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee Dick Durbin taking issue with Hillary.
If it's a fair election, I am 100% on board. But if I see tens of thousands of ballots being manipulated, I can't go along with that. Hey, they found ballots in a waste paper basket 3 days ago, and they all had the name military ballots. They were military. They all had the name Trump on them.
I think it's better if you go before the election, because I think this scam that the Democrats are pulling, it's a scam. This scam will be before the United States Supreme Court. And I think having a 4-4 situation is not a good situation.
Joe Biden should not concede under any circumstances, because I think this is going to drag out, and eventually I do believe he will win if we don't give an inch.
I disagree with Hillary Clinton. I respect her, I like her, but I think she's just flat out wrong. If we are going to maintain a democracy, peaceful transition through an election is the only way to do it. Whoever the winner is, if it is clear and legal, that should be announced and the other party should concede.
it is actually conceivable that the loser of this election will never concede, because counting the expected deluge of mail-in ballots may take days or weeks, and courts in crucial swing states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, have extended the deadlines for counting ballots to days past the election. Quick break, and then we're back to try and gather some semblance of perspective on everything that's happened this year with the editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, there is little left to say and lament in this damnable year of 2020. We'll live with a downdraft of this year for the rest of our lives. And now it is framed, bookended by the most virulent pandemic in over 100 years, the onset of it early in the year, and now as autumn sets in, the president himself contracting the virus and setting an already historically chaotic political environment into a state of uncertainty unparalleled in our lifetimes. And of course, in between, we had an economic meltdown, horrific job losses, entire industries put on ice, and then raging violence in cities across the land, the most bitter racial and political divisions in the last 50 years, or perhaps even since the Civil War, a war over the Supreme Court, and now this. Here to try and make sense of it all, somehow, is the editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com, and most decidedly my better half, Leesa K. Donner. Hello, Leesa.
Hi, Tim.
Now, you and I have shared the thought that, as in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. But I gotta say, this jaw-dropping succession of unparalleled events sure feels like nothing any of us or the country has ever come close to experiencing before.
Well, it's kind of funny because I tend to not get rattled at these things. And yet I think this is the classic, it is the best of times, it is the worst of times. I mean, high drama. I personally don't think this is a huge game changer. Unlike you wrote eloquently and you made a good case, but I beg to differ. And it is possible for husbands and wives to disagree and still get along, I think. I think most voters have really made up their mind. I think Trump has always said he's a fighter, and now he has a real wonderful opportunity to show that.
How about the reaction to Trump's diagnosis from the left? A lot of commentary about how he ridiculed masks and that his chickens are now coming home to roost. Do they have a point?
No, I don't think they have a point. I mean, anybody can get it, at any time, anywhere. It's pretty clear he got it from one of his staffers, Hope Hicks. But look at it this way. We have a situation where Biden, he sort of has to take the gloves off a little bit and start playing nice in the sandbox. I mean, it's not nice to beat up on somebody who has a possible deadly disease.
Now, many Americans already feel extremely insecure because of this virus and the lost jobs and the mob violence and the explosive, incendiary political climate. And now the 74-year-old president with a weight issue has a virus that can be particularly deadly for people over 65 with an underlying condition like obesity. All of this with a month to go before Election Day. How much can people take? How much can this country absorb?
I think you have to be willing to separate the wheat from the chaff. I mean, I don't think a Big Mac and supersized fries are going to kill Donald Trump. I just really don't. And he has a weight. A lot of Americans have a weight issue, So I think that we have to take it one step at a time. We have to look, his campaign is going to have to change in the next 10 or 15 days. But if anybody has proven that you can run a presidential campaign from one room, it's Joe Biden. So, I think if Trump is smart, he makes the most of Zoom. I would virtually show up at those rallies or buy airtime.
But seeing that he's already down in the polls and now he's in effect disabled for half of the remaining 30 days of the campaign at least, can Trump possibly be reelected under these circumstances?
Okay, I just want to point out one quote from Mark Angelides today, and he said, he mentioned about in April, UK Prime Minister tested positive for the coronavirus, despite the polarization of his leadership up until that point. Angelides wrote, the nation felt a surge of sympathy and support with folks applauding him from their doorstep. The point is that Trump could even get more support from this. And I have to go back to my original thought, which is I believe what Rasmussen says is true, which is there are maybe 3 or 4% undecided.
We've talked a lot about Joe Biden's senility, which some 60% of people believe he's in the early stages of senility. And now you have a president who, let's face it, his health is going to be in question when people go to the polls on November 3rd, no matter whether he goes back out on the campaign trail or not.
Well, look, Tim, this is what you get when you have a 74 and a 78-year-old men running for the highest office in the land. I mean, you especially in a year where there's like a worldwide deadly virus. I mean, we all knew this going in. They knew this before the Democratic convention. They knew this before the Republican convention. This is not news. And I really don't think it has to change much, except maybe the style in which the president is campaigning.
Okay, Leesa, thanks for bringing us down to earth and providing some perspective and allowing us, for at least the time we've been together, not to panic too much. Thanks for joining.
All right. As we often say to each other, no sudden moves.
No sudden moves. Slow and steady wins the race, doesn't it?
Indeed. Thanks, Tim.
Leesa K. Donner, Editor-in-Chief of LibertyNation.com. Stay right there, because when we return, we'll dive into a fundamental issue: why a startling number of voters now distrust the election process itself.
Extra, read all about it. Election 2020 Big Bottom Flash Reports are coming. On election night, at the bottom of every hour, LibertyNation.com will give you Election Night 2020, 90 seconds at a time, with our Big Bottom Flash Reports. You'll get the drop with our one-stop shop. We'll shed the light on Fight Night. Tune into LibertyNation.com on election night for our Big Bottom Flash Reports at the bottom of every hour. 90 glorious seconds for everything you need to know without the spin.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, in 2016, Donald Trump scored his most unlikely victory over Hillary Clinton with great support from white people, but just 8% of blacks and 30% of Hispanics. But in a great irony and reversal of fortune, Trump now appears to be in trouble with a block of white voters, those much discussed white suburban women, while he might actually be making serious inroads among blacks and Hispanics. And in an effort to crystallize his plans for the black community, Trump has unveiled what he calls the Platinum Plan for the revitalization of majority black communities. And here to discuss what's in the plan, whether it will actually lead to an uptick in Trump's minority vote, and some disturbing attitudes of voters about the very integrity of the upcoming election, is LibertyNation.com socio-political correspondent Jeff Charles. Jeff, welcome back.
Hey, Tim, what's good? How you doing?
Pleasure to have you. So we'll get to the election integrity issue and how many voters are prone to believe the results can't be trusted. But first, you've written an excellent analysis of the Trump Platinum Plan for black communities. And by the way, I love how Trump calls it the Platinum Plan, like it's a package plan for one of his resorts. But tell us what's in the Platinum Plan, and more importantly, whether the benefits of it will really be felt by people with Democrats controlling power in all the cities that the Trump plan is aimed at.
Yeah. So the plan itself, it is a very aggressive free market type of plan. It's really designed not so much for the government to just pour a lot of money into Black communities, but it's designed to give Black people access to more capital. It focuses heavily on entrepreneurship. I mean, they want to have 500,000 new Black-owned small businesses opening. They want to add 3 million jobs. They want to help revitalize the community using the free market, rather than just government program after government program that will help to a certain level, but prevent the Black community from getting beyond that. So that's what I like about it. It also focuses on education, school choice, that's important. Also healthcare, to research health disparities between the Black community and other Americans. So all these things are very important. If he's able to even accomplish some of these things, it will be a big benefit. However, it's going to be very hard for that to happen because President Trump is at the federal level. And this is yet another reason why local politics is so crucial, because any of these programs or any of the measures that he wants to implement is going to have to go through state and local governments. And the local governments in the cities that in which Black people are doing the worst are run by Democrats, who have a vested interest in making sure that Black people don't rise above a certain level. So it's going to be hard for the Black residents to actually reap these benefits. I'm not saying that they won't have any benefits from this plan if Trump is able to implement it, but it won't reach its potential with Democrat governance in a lot of these cities who don't want it to work.
Now, does Joe Biden have any kind of plan to compete with that, or the Trump's Platinum Plan, or does you think Biden sort of believes just leave it alone? He's already going to get a high percentage of the Black vote. Don't even acknowledge that such a plan was introduced.
Yeah, so former Vice President Biden does have a Black agenda. It's called the Lift Every Voice and Sing. It's named after the Black national anthem. A lot of it was heavily dependent on government funding, on government programs. There were a few things in there that I liked. I mean, if there was a little bit of a focus on entrepreneurship, not as much as Trump's plan. But what I really want to highlight here, though, is that this is the first time in recent memory that both presidential candidates have outlined a specifically Black agenda in recent memory. And typically Republicans don't do this kind of thing. But Trump's plan is what I call unapologetically Black. All throughout that document, it highlights the African-American community, the Black community. There's no euphemisms in there. It's specifically for Black people. So both candidates are actually competing for the Black vote.
So, Jeff, you talked about the roadblocks that the Democrats who run all of these cities would put up in the way of Trump's Platinum Plan if he's reelected. But let's look at the other side of it. Is there any evidence that the looting and riots and destruction in so many cities run by Democrats is causing Black people to rethink their commitment to the party and the sort of one-party system that rules in so many of these urban centers? Or is there more a larger sense that Trump actually is what the elite media has been saying, a racist? And no matter the energy he's poured into creating more jobs than ever, or funding historically Black colleges, or his opportunity zones, or criminal justice reform?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I actually think it's a little bit of both, because I think Black people, I think this election season, they've already been kind of seeing that the Democrats don't really represent them. And so, but I do think that a lot of them believe a lot of what the media says about Trump. Now, I do think that there are a lot of Black people who are going more towards Trump or more towards Republicans. I don't think it's in as high numbers as we would want, but I think it's still happening. But I think more are just starting to become even more fed up with the Democratic Party. But I think what's happening now is that it's starting to get worse. And when you see that the far left progressive wing taking over the party and pushing things like defund the police, despite the fact that 80% of Black Americans don't want that to happen, you see that the Black people are seeing even more that a lot of these white progressives don't necessarily have Black people's best interests at heart, which is why, and we've talked about this before, it's why I think that a lot of Black people are just going to say a pox on both your houses and stay home.
Okay, so switching gears for a second here, you wrote another piece recently on LibertyNation.com entitled Alarming American Attitudes about the 2020 election, in which you write, a recent Yahoo News YouGov survey showed that a small percentage of Americans think that the 2020 election will be free and fair. The poll taken in mid-September revealed that Americans of all political persuasions doubt the integrity of the upcoming election. Half of Trump supporters and 37% of Biden supporters agree that the election will not be free and fair. This is really shocking stuff. What's the root of this widespread fear that the election won't be free and fair?
Yeah, and you're right to use the word shocking. I mean, in 2020, there's very little that shocks me anymore. But when I saw this, I was pretty surprised. You know, I think where it's coming from is just, I think a lot of it has to do with the state of our political discourse. I mean, you saw the debate the other night. That is a representation for how political discourse is right now. And what we're seeing is both parties are already basically setting up their excuses for as to why they might lose. And none of it has to do with the fact that the election will be free and fair. So on the right, you have people saying, oh, there's going to be widespread voter fraud if we lose. And that's what the narrative will be. On the other hand, if Biden loses, they're going to say it's widespread voter suppression. And the reality is that there isn't really compelling evidence that either of these things happen on a level that would be widespread enough to impact the result of a presidential election.
Right. So you quote an expert on that subject in your story, an advisor to Vice President Pence, who certainly expressed doubts about the possibility of a rigged election. His quote was, "You're not going to see widespread fraud in a presidential or Senate or governor's race. It's just not feasible, and it hasn't been in 70 or 80 years. So should people on either side really go down this road of being fearful of a rigged election?"
No, we shouldn't. I don't think that this election will be rigged. I agree with what the advisor to Mike Pence said. I think and maybe in very rare cases, maybe with a congressional race. I mean, we saw what happened with Al Franken's race. But in general, overall, there's not really a good way to rig an election in a way that's actually going to make a difference in the outcome. Yeah, we've seen voter fraud in local, state, federal races. But there's no evidence that it could occur to the extent to which it could swing the election for Trump or for Biden.
Yes, but the perception among people is still shocking, no matter whether it's based on reality or not. So before I let you go, Jeff, here's the closing question for you. What do you think is a realistic target number for Donald Trump among Black and Hispanic voters?
Yeah, I would say for Black voters, I think the stretch goal would be 15%, but I think that'd be the very most. I think it's going to look more like between 10 and 12%, maybe. I think he is going to increase his Black support. Among Hispanics, like you said, he got 29 or 30% in 2016. He is making a concerted effort to reach Hispanic voters, and we've seen in states like Florida, a lot of them are supporting him. So I think he may even get more of a bump there. So I could see probably, 30%. I'd probably see maybe like 35 to at the stretch goal might be 40%.
All right, Jeff, thanks once again for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Jeff Charles, socio-political correspondent for LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we're back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now we have reached the portion of the program where we put the whipped cream on top, or maybe even the cherry. It's called Talkin' Liberty. It's at the heart of Liberty Nation Radio. And so we welcome back our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, and LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, or the man who we prefer to call our guardian of individual liberty, Scott David Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim. Hard to feel bad after that great introduction. Thank you so much.
Yes, well, we try to get you into fighting shape here. So let's talk about fighting shape. Breonna Taylor and the grand jury and some of the extraordinary things that have happened surrounding this case in Louisville, Kentucky.
There is so much to kind of unpack here, Tim. So I think when we last checked in, it was before the grand jury. The grand jury no-billed for the killing of Breonna Taylor, that her death was not a crime that can be attributable to one of the police officers, and that one of the police officers was charged with a crime for recklessly firing shots into other people's apartments, not Breonna Taylor's. What we've now had is that the judge wishes to release a transcript of the tapes of the grand jury proceedings. And that's going to happen. The Attorney General was granted a delay so that they could be redacted for telephone and personal information, telephone numbers and social security information and the like. But Tim, the other crazy thing that's happened that has never before that anybody kind of has heard of is one of the grand jurors has basically sued. They've filed a motion in court to try to get their vow of secrecy lifted. Right now, if they were to speak, they could be liable for criminal contempt and serve time in jail or prison, and almost certainly they would. One of the very sacrosanct measures of our system is that grand jurors not talk about the evidence that was presented in the grand jury. And with a mind, by the way, towards roasting the prosecution and making a kind of a point that there was racial bias without evidence. That's sort of my analysis of the reasoning behind the move. I think it's very important, and what we're going to see in the future here is that the public is going to be outraged by what they perceive as bias in the grand jury presentment. But that's because they have no experience with grand jury presentments. If they were to listen to grand jury presentments where white persons were the people who were dead or the accused, they would see that it's essentially the same thing.
Now, in your article on this issue in LibertyNation.com, you use it as a springboard to discuss the grand jury process and where it stands today. It's something that's specifically outlined in the Constitution, but there have been so many problems with it, not the least of which is the one-sided presentation, and now the full privacy granted a grand jury inquiry is now in doubt as well.
The problem is prosecutions go light on police defense, the police when they're investigating in the grand jury. That's the kind of rub that has the people who are skeptical of police power on edge. And that runs from Black Lives Matter to straight up libertarianish Republicans. Okay. There are many counties in the United States, big counties in the United States, that have had plenty of police shootings, and never a single one has ever been passed through the grand jury to indictment, to a point where it becomes almost clownish, where it's like really not a single one has ever been. And so, but the problem is those police officers are also U.S. citizens entitled to every protection and right under the Constitution. California, Tim, tried to basically dissolve a number of the rights that police officers have in the grand jury process, and that attempt was overturned. So the elegance with which we have to craft a solution to this matter is high, and I think it's beyond certainly the broadsword swords that we've seen in the fight so far. It has to be a scalpel, and we have to get in there and figure out a way that police officers can have their rights protected, and yet also the grand jury process isn't a sham. It wasn't put in place to be a buoy or check on the life of Breonna Taylor, but a check on charges against people who may have killed her, whether those people are black or white. And by the way, grand jury presentments that don't involve police charges, the idea that they somehow benefit whites over blacks, we have no evidence presented that shows that.
All right, from Louisville, Kentucky, we move to Annapolis, Maryland, where a student has sued the Naval Academy over his expulsion for social media posts, raising the whole question of to what degree the military service can control the private utterings of their students.
I think it's a fascinating issue and story, Tim. I think we mentioned briefly some weeks ago, there's a case out of Philadelphia where some police officers were fired for Facebook posts attributed to them. And I just think that this is another case. This is not a case where people have uttered racial slurs, for instance, which have been ruled that governments can dismiss people from service for. This is just an opinion about whether or not what somebody said was racist. And this has to do, Tim, with this broader notion. I think when 10 years ago, we could all agree something that was racist involved a statement that indicated a preference for one race over another. And this has nothing to do with that. This is the sort of broader where if you say something I don't like, I get to sort of say that you're racist.
And the beat goes on with COVID. In Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis has banned localities from collecting fines for people either not wearing masks or perhaps wearing them improperly. But local officials say they'll keep issuing fines anyway. Something's got to give. What's it going to be, Scott?
Well, I hope it's the local officials, because what we've seen and the investigations have seen, I think the Miami Herald has done these investigations. They're using it like a speed trap, Tim. It's so maddening that they're basically laying in wait for where they suspect people who will be in no danger to anyone or themselves will be out of doors without a mask. We're not talking about some businesses operating as speakeasy where people are crammed together spreading the COVID. We're talking about people who are outside in Florida walking around being ticketed with a $100 fine for the crime of not having a mask, in violation, by the way, of the state directive. So let's hope that DeSantis and the state authorities can crack down on the craven. And I do think it's craven. I think it's about the money, Tim. $100 a piece. You can imagine they don't have all the parking fines and the other things that they're used to fill their coffers on the backs of the citizens.
Have we not reached the point where state law is supreme over local law, the same way federal law is supreme over state law?
I think that for the officials in question, the supremacy question is secondary to them being able to retire at 57 and a half with a 95% pension for the next 25 years on the backs of the taxpayers. But I could be wrong.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose with our own Mark Angelides. All of them available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week. Same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.